What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up another top 10 Spotlight decks of the week. That's right, the top 10 Spotlight decks of the week, and as previously mentioned in our previous week, this is not a top 10 meta report or a top 10 decks of the week. It's more of just 10 decks that I've chosen to spotlight this week to talk about what's going on in Pokemon Pocket. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 1. So deck number 1 on our Spotlight decks of the week is going to be Charizard X, and the reason for this is over this past week it actually won a tournament. I believe the tournament was Pocket League number 2, and also had an additional top in another tournament this week with basically the exact same deck. Both these decks checked in the baby Charizard, and this is an interesting shift that we have seen because we've already seen this shift happen in the Mewtwo decks. The fact that Mewtwo and Gardevoir are also adding in the additional baby Mewtwo. I wonder if this is going to be a theme going forward with most decks. The baby Charizard still hits for a massive 150 attack, still discarding 2 energies, but basically 150 attack takes out almost every single Pokemon in the deck, and so it doesn't really seem like that much of a downgrade. And the fact that it's only a single prize, if this is your first Charizard out onto the field and you can trade a 2 for 1 or a 2 for none, it's a pretty significant thing to happen in this deck. I wonder if this means that this is kind of officially going to replace the old Charizard decks that weren't playing baby Charizard, and if maybe this kind of creates the conversation that Charizard is maybe actually still better than Arcanine or not. I think the verdict is not really out yet on that, but it would be very interesting to see where that goes in the future. With that being said, let's move on to deck number 2. So for deck number 2, we're going to be talking about Stari EX, to be more specific, as Stari EX and Greninja. Greninja has actually topped a couple of times this past week, and I'll get into the second deck soon, because that will be deck number 3. But for a deck in a water that's very weak into the Pikachu meta right now, it's very interesting to kind of see possibly a shift in water decks, popping more with something like Greninja. And the most interesting thing about this deck specifically is not even the Greninja, it's actually the fact that it didn't play any Misties at all. And I don't know what that means specifically, because it almost seems like Misty is actually one of the strongest cards to have in a water deck. So the fact that this deck didn't do it, that could potentially maybe be something to look out for in the future as well. The fact that we're playing Greninjas now. I mean, we've been playing Greninjas in Starmie decks, but now that we're starting to see it top a little bit more, multiple times in 1 week with 2 different decks, and also with no Misty, this might be an interesting shift for water decks to look out for. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 3. So for deck number 3, it's actually a Articuno Greninja deck now instead of a Stari EX and Greninja deck. This deck also made a top this past week, and the fact that it was also with Greninja, as said previously, is super duper interesting, and it was done without Stari EX. So technically, this deck is actually kind of slower than the previous deck we talked about, but yet it's still topping. And so again, this is a very interesting possible shift in water decks that we might see going forward. The fact that this deck does play Misties, which obviously, I mean, we would think it would play, but again, in the Starmie deck it didn't. This deck does need it a little bit more because Articuno actually does take a little bit longer to get online. You do want that hit with the Misty. This is a little bit slower of a deck, yet it's still topped, and so I would like to see going forward, next week on my spotlight list, where water decks will be. Will we be playing Greninjas? Will the Greninjas be played with Starmie or Articuno, or played with both? Will we be playing Misties? I don't know, but it's very interesting for the future. And with that being said, let's get into deck number 4. The next deck we want to talk about in the Spotlight Decks of the Week is Mankey Marowak. And this deck also saw a couple of tops. I believe it was 2 in tournaments this past week, which is super interesting because this was also a deck that was spotlighted on KM Best's channel. I think it's KM Pocket, his Pocket one, and where he goes on to explain like why it's like so good into the meta. And it's interesting to see like right after that video dropped that this started to get into top cut placements in tournaments. This deck also is obviously playing the Mankey promo version of Mankey, which will probably always be played in every Mankey deck going forward. Which allows you to start hitting in for like 100 damage like really early on with your Primate once you get it online. And this deck also allows you to get in those big swings in the game with your Marowak EX. So it's like a really strong attacking deck for like minimal damage. Both the Primate and Marowak only take 2 energy requirement each. This deck also plays a specific fighting type in Marowak that's weak to grass, and a specific fighting type in Primate that's weak to Psychic. This is very good into the Pikachu meta regardless because it's fighting, so it hits all electric pretty much for fighting type weakness except for Zapdos. But you're also kind of hedging your bets by playing 1 weak to grass and 1 weak to Psychic, because when you're in that Mewtwo matchup, even though your Primate is weak to Psychic, if you get it on early enough, 1, you can make a huge swing with your Primate, and even if you don't, you can still make up for it with your Marowak EX being able to hit for 160 damage, which would absolutely take out the Mewtwo as well, and it wouldn't be weak to Mewtwo. So this is like really good deck, and it's also like really interesting for fighting types and see where they may go in Pocket in the future, whether it's meta or just in like a ladder scenario. And I would like to see where it goes going forward. But with that being said, let's get into deck number 5. Future Shan here. For the next portion of this video, I'm going to be removing the background music, which is the music played from the Pokemon Pocket game. And I just want to know in the future from the viewers, that is, to leave a comment in the below to let me know if you would prefer to continue to have the music in the background, or if you would prefer not to have the music in the background at all. And with that being said, let's move forward. The next Spotlight deck of the week is Pikachu EX, and more specifically the Raichu build. And this is beginning to look like a lot more the definitive version of the deck. This deck in Pikachu X, I believe, placed in like won 7 of 9 tournaments this past week with 150 players or more, with 5 of those 7 wins being the Pikachu Raichu version. Previously, it looked like Zebstrika was like the build that everyone was looking into because it was having, I think, the majority of the tops at the time. But again, this seems to be a recent shift into the Raichu build. And originally, it was actually, I think a lot of people were thinking it was going to be like the Electrode version of the deck, and then it kind of shifted into Zebstrika, and now it really does seem like it's shifting into Raichu. But I mean, who knows what this will look like going forward. I don't want to spend too much time on this deck because it is literally the best deck that everyone sees all the time, plays all the time, and there's not really much more to be said other than the fact that you know, Raichu is starting to seem like the definitive version of the deck. But again, you know what? Next week, this might completely change. It might go back to Zebstrika. It might go back to Electrode, or it might continue to be Raichu, or something else might change in the deck completely that might allow us to see what the change may be. But I think the reason, just to kind of finish off on this, is why it's becoming Raichu is because Raichu is such a strong finisher. And now that we have seen recently that Mewtwo is really starting to kind of make a stronger argument for being possibly the top deck, and it has started to like see a lot more wins in tournaments recently over the Pikachu decks. Raichu just allows you to kind of really get over that Mewtwo issue. It is 140 attack with mixed in with Giovanni's. You're just basically taking out almost anything for 150 attack at that point, and it's a tremendous finisher. So, anyways, with that being said, let's get into deck number 6. We are talking about the Team Rocket deck, Arbok and Weasen once again, like we did last week. And so you might be asking yourself, well, why do we have Wigglytuff EX up on the screen? Well, it's because this deck is now starting to tech in the 1/1 line of Jigglypuff and Wigglytuff, which is super duper interesting. Last week we talked about both decks. Actually, we talked about an Arbok Weasen deck, which is the Team Rocket deck, and a Wigglytuff Weasen deck, and we talked about them separately. And now it seems that people are beginning to play a mix of these two decks together. This deck also topped two very large tournaments this past week. The tournaments I've been looking at this to kind of make this video and to look into interesting decks and what people are doing to make decks interesting that aren't very considered very big or top meta decks is looking at like tournaments that are 150 people or more. I actually also saw this exact same deck in a tournament that I played in, a very much smaller one. I just went into a tournament this week. Don't ask me how it went. It went horrible. I was testing out a new Alakazam deck, and it wasn't very successful. But anyways, this deck is very interesting. By combining these like 3 stage 1 decks into one deck, it kind of mixes all the strengths together in one deck. The Arbok Weasen is still very strong into the meta decks, and with the ability to be able to like two-shot any of their the majority of the EX Pokemon in those decks. A Arbok with 2 attacks and a mix of poisons and Giovanni's can obviously take out pretty much every EX Pokemon that we're talking about. Pikachu, Zapdos, Starmie, Articuno, Moltres. And this deck also has the advantage of mixing the Weasen and Wigglytuff strategy, which is being able to tank with both these Pokemon and chip in for a ton of damage while utilizing their status effects. This also allows you to stack both of the status effects in Poison and Sleep together, which is a super duper strong combo that can help you win a lot of games. I, of course, said it would be interesting last week to see where both of these decks go, as we talked about them separately, and where they go going forward. And it seems like this might be where they have gone and where they will continue to go, is taking these two decks and combining both of them together to make an extremely strong deck to be able to counter the meta. So this might very well be the new anti-meta deck going forward. And with that being said, let's move on to deck number 7. The next deck we want to talk about is a Nidoking Weasen deck, and this is super interesting. This also obviously topped this week in a tournament that was at least 150 people or more. And this was a deck that was I've seen a lot of different content being created on this deck by a bunch of different content creators, and every time I saw it I was like, I had like zero interest. I was like, what? I don't think this deck's good at all. Why are people making it? But I guess it's a little bit better than I originally thought, because it did make a top cut. Obviously, this deck uses Weasen Koga package, which will allow you to kind of create a loop so you can continue to tank while you build up the stage 2 Pokemon in Nidoking that takes 3 energy to just do 90 damage, which is why I was kind of like, why is this deck even being played? It doesn't seem that strong. But I mean, when you add the fact that every single Pokemon that you're attacking is going to be poisoned, because you either poisoned it with Weasen or you have poisoned it with Nidoking's attack, because when you attack with Nidoking, you poison the other Pokemon. So technically, it's at minimum 100 damage for 3 energy, which is not too bad, I guess, on a Pokemon that's a single prize Pokemon. And you're also hidden into a large part of the meta for weakness, because Mewtwo is obviously, and most Psychic, if not all Psychic, are weak to darkness. So you can actually output quite a bit of damage, and both your Pokemon that you're playing you're utilizing the poison status effect, because again, both of the Pokemon, Weasen and Nidoking, poison your opponent's Pokemon. So over time you can do a lot of damage, and I guess that's probably why this was successful. But it would be interesting to see where this goes, and if this has any new developments going forward in the next couple of days or weeks. And with that being said, let's move on to deck number 8. So the next deck we want to talk about in the Spotlight Decks of the Week is another Blastoise deck. Last week we talked about Blastoise and the fact that it topped a tournament previously with the inclusion of something like Baby Mewtwo. And so there's been a lot of discussion lately whether or not Mewtwo, or Baby Mewtwo for instance, is like possibly the new interesting tank that we want to be using in these stage 2 decks that require a lot of energy requirement in order to get off those big attacks to kind of sweep games. In this case, the player completely removed all of the tanks. We are not playing a Kangaskhan, we are not playing a Snorlax, and we are not playing Baby Mewtwo. We're not even playing Articuno, Baby Articuno. And so this is interesting because what we're doing instead, and again, this deck actually did top a tournament that was at least 150 players or more in the past week. And what they've done is they've added Meowths. Now, I never thought that a Meowth Blastoise deck would be the way to go, but I guess when you really do want to get those Blastoise online and get them online as quick as possible, and if you're getting those lucky Misty hits, you're going to be putting a lot of energy and outputting a lot of damage. And when you're facing things like obviously Mewtwo, Charizard, and Pikachu in the meta, you're going to be taking all these decks out, or all these cards out, in one shot, basically, with Blastoise. And the cool thing about Blastoise, too, is because it's 180 attack, even if Pikachu attacks it first, you're still absorbing that hit. It hits for weakness, but it doesn't really matter. So you get hit, and then you just completely take them out. I'm very shocked that Blastoise continues to top. We probably thought as a community that it would not be a meta deck, but you never know. Water decks are starting to really make a splash. I still think water decks are not good enough right now, totally, to be playing in the meta when there's so many Pikachu decks out there, and the Pikachu and electric decks in general are just so strong. I think something a little bit more significant going forward really needs to change to really get water over that final hump into that S tier with Pikachu and Mewtwo. And honestly, I think that one thing, just to kind of get it out of the way, is I think new water Pokemon have to start coming out in this mini set and the future sets that aren't weak to water. For instance, Frostmoth right now is, I think, the only Pokemon, or the water Pokemon in the game, that isn't weak to electric. In fact, he's weak to steel, and that's because he's something like an ice type in the actual anime and video games. And water Pokemon are usually also weak to grass. So if new water Pokemon start coming out that are weak to grass, you might finally start to see that final shift of water decks getting into the meta. But it is really interesting for water decks right now, the fact that as 2 Greninja decks and a Blastoise deck are starting to top a lot more than I previously thought they were, is very interesting for water decks in general. And so with that being said, let's move on to deck number 9. So the next deck we want to talk about in the Spotlight Decks of the Week is a personal build of mine, and it's a Graplock Pidgeot deck. This, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the community who have been watching my videos. This is by far the largest video that just completely blew up. My videos have been getting around maybe 100 views, and this one just completely blew up in one day to over 1,000 views, and it's still climbing. So thank you all so much for that. I really appreciate it. But why I'm spotlighting this is for a couple of reasons, and I think the reason why this has kind of really exploded, this video that I made, is because it's a control deck. It seems to be that like people really want to kind of learn or see what control decks are out there. These seem to be a very popular style of deck, and that's exactly what this is. You're combined in Pidgeot and Grotlock together to kind of control which Pokemon your opponent has out onto the field, and then also combining them with Hitmonlee. You can hit something onto the bench, bring a Hitmonlee in, hit something onto the bench with your Graplock, bring your Hitmonlee in, and finish it off. It perfectly takes out a Pikachu in that sense. You can also hit something onto the bench, get them under that 70-point damage that Graplock would be able to attack them with, and bring them back in with the Pidgeot. This is a really cool, interesting deck. I don't think in any way, shape, or form this is currently a meta deck. This isn't a meta report anyways. A lot of the decks I talked about aren't meta decks either. They have been in tournaments and placement, and that's what's interesting about them, but this is not a meta report. This deck is just a control deck, and I really do think people are searching for control decks, and we have very few control decks in Pokemon Pocket right now, and this is one of them that is really cool and interesting. So if you want to try it out, go ahead. If you want to check out my full breakdown, check out the video in the description. And with that being said, let's move on to deck number 10. The next deck for the Spotlight Decks of the Week, the last and final one, I want to talk about another personal build, and of course it's another control deck. We just talked about how we believe that, or I believe that the community is really interested in control decks in Pokemon Pocket. There are very few. I just talked about the Graplock. Last week we talked about Psyduck Gengar, and now we're going to talk about Bird Keeper Control, as I call it, because you're taking the two bird Pokemon that have control elements, and Pidgeot and Pharaoh, and combining them together. In this case, we already know what Pidgeot does, but what Pharaoh does is he has the Drill Run attack for 2 colorless energy. It does 50 damage, and it also flips a coin, and if heads, you get to remove a random energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. This is actually like really good if everything goes as planned. Obviously, you can get those tails, which absolutely suck, but even against decks that like play Mewtwo or any kind of card that is very heavy, reliant on a lot of energy, Mewtwo, Charizard, Venusaur, Blastoise, if you can get in with a Drill Run very early and keep getting those heads, you can really set those decks back and start chipping in for a lot of damage. We're also playing a Farfetch, which is very important because you want to be able to hit in early for a significant amount of damage, at least enough so that when you do bring in a Pidgeot or Pharaoh, that you can actually take the other EX Pokemon out. And it's because this deck like maxes out at its ceiling at 70 damage with the Pidgeot. Again, this is a very budget deck. It's a theme deck and it's a control deck. It's very fun, very interesting. But more specifically, I want to talk about coin flip cards because they're excuse me, very few and far between that are actually being played for like meta purposes. We have Zapdos, Moltres, and Misty, and that's pretty much it. We also do have the occasional Marowak, and we also talked about him earlier in the video. But I would like to see where these RNG coin flip cards and decks go in the future, especially with mini sets coming out and the new full sets coming out later on in January as well. And if we will get any type of support for these types of cards in the paper TCG, they have item cards that when you attach it to your Pokemon, if it has an effect on its attack or ability that flips a coin, the tool that you attach to it, I forget its name, will allow you, if you choose to reflip those coins. There's also Pokemon like Victini, which you can just Google search in the thing and find out what he does. He has an ability that when he's either on the bench or in the active, when a Pokemon uses a coin flip effect, you can choose, if you don't like those, to redo the coin flip. And so it'd be really interesting to see where the meta goes if these types of item cards are introduced into the future of the game, especially since we know item cards are coming out. And I really hope that these sets, whether it's the mini set or the future full sets that come out, start to support the decks and cards in the game that currently need to get over some type of hump to kind of make them better or push them into some type of medicine. This deck, as well as the previous, again, are personal builds, no way, shape, or form a meta build, but we also have something recently that a lot of content creators have been talking about, which is the no EX format. Both of these decks can be absolutely played in that as well, and they might even be better in those formats. So basically what you do is you go into private match and you just type in all caps, one word, NOEX, no EX. And there's a lot of people apparently playing this, and you can queue into games very easily. So if you want to try these decks out and you don't feel like trying them out on regular ladder, you can go and try them out there. Or you can test your skill and try to face these Venusaurs, these Mewtwo's, these Charizards, and these Blastoise with this deck to see how you do. But anyways, with that being said, that is it for the video. Thank you all very much. And as always, keep cooking.